6 months of savings. Gone in one afternoon. The bulldozer showed up while I was at work. Neighbors watched from their porches. Phones already recording. I didn't scream. I just smiled. Karen thought she'd won. 3 days later, the county called an emergency meeting. Her own signature was about to bury her. By Friday, Ridgeview Estates would never be the same. My name is Dana Whitfield, 34, and I've lived in Ridgeview Estates for 6 years with my husband Marcus and our daughter Lily. We bought the house for the canyon view, the quiet cul-de-sac, and the promise of a real community. I never imagined a hedge could nearly destroy all three. Marcus works nights as a paramedic, so it's usually just Lily and me, watching wildfire updates every August like a weather forecast. After the Canyon Ridge fire jumped 2 ridgelines in 2019 and stopped 4 miles from our fence line, I stopped treating defensible space as optional. That fire changed something in this neighborhood. For weeks afterward, ash fell like gray snow and the sky turned the color of a bruise. Half the block slept with go-bags by the door. The county fire department started holding town halls about wildland urban interface risk, and I went to every one. At one of those meetings, a fire inspector named Bill Torres explained defensible space zones, how the right vegetation, spaced and trimmed correctly, could stop embers from reaching a house. He handed out a list of approved fire-resistant plants for our elevation. I kept that list in my kitchen drawer for years. Our property backs up to open brushland, the kind of dry chaparral that turns into kindling every summer. Most of my neighbors ignored the fire department's advice and kept their decorative junipers and old pine straw right up against their fences. I couldn't stop thinking about how fast that stuff would burn. I started small, clearing dead brush, raking pine needles, cutting back a rotting oleander hedge my in-laws had planted decades earlier. Marcus thought I was overreacting. Then, in 2022, a spot fire started 2 canyons over from a discarded cigarette, and it took helicopters 4 hours to knock it down. That was the summer I decided to build what Inspector Torres called a living firebreak, a barrier of low flammability native shrubs, spaced and pruned to exact county specifications, running the length of our property line where it met the wildland. It wasn't decorative. It was insurance for my family. I hired a landscaper who specialized in fire-adapted design, pulled permits through the county, and spent nearly $8,000, most of what we'd saved for a kitchen remodel, on drought-tolerant manzanita, low sage, and irrigation lines rated for defensible space. Marcus called it my second mortgage. I called it peace of mind. Ridgeview Estates has an HOA, the kind with a thick binder of rules about mailbox color and approved paint swatches. I'd mostly ignored it for years, paying my dues and staying out of meetings. That changed the year Karen Prescott became board president, because Karen noticed everything, and Karen had opinions about all of it. Karen moved into the neighborhood 2 years before I did. Into the biggest house on the ridge, the one with imported Italian cypress trees and a fountain shaped like a lion's head. She ran for HOA president unopposed and made it clear, in her first newsletter, that Ridgeview was becoming her personal project. Her vision was what she called resort aesthetic, matching boxwood hedges, white gravel, agave in uniform rows. She circulated a landscaping palette booklet with approved plants and colors, and anything outside it got a violation notice taped to your door, usually with a smiley face sticker that somehow made it worse. I met Karen properly at a block party the spring before I built my firebreak. She complimented my cute little cottage garden in a tone that wasn't a compliment at all, then asked, unprompted, whether I'd considered something more cohesive with the neighborhood's brand. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The first real friction came at a board meeting where the HOA proposed spending $40,000 from the reserve fund on decorative entrance gates. I asked, politely, whether that money might be better spent on fire mitigation for the whole community, given our canyon exposure. Karen's smile didn't move, but her eyes did. We hired professionals for reserve fund decisions, she said, and moved on to the next agenda item without acknowledging my question again. Afterward, a woman named Nadia Ferris, the HOA treasurer, caught up with me in the parking lot and quietly told me I wasn't wrong to ask. I didn't know yet how much that would matter. Nadia had been on the board for 3 years and struck me as one of the only members who actually read the bylaws instead of just enforcing them. She mentioned, almost in passing, that a former board member named Ruth Delgado had asked similar questions about spending the year before, and had resigned suddenly soon after. I didn't think much of it then. I was focused on my fire break, which had grown in beautifully over that first-year silvery sage. Low-mounding manzanita, everything exactly as Inspector Torres had specified, everything permitted, everything photographed and filed with the county as proof of compliance with defensible space law. Karen noticed it almost immediately, within a week of the shrubs filling in along our back fence. I found a violation notice taped to my door, citing unapproved landscaping inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. Section 4.2. No smiley face this time. Just her signature, pressed hard enough to tear the paper slightly. I called the HOA management office and explained that the plantings were fire code compliant, permitted through the county, and recommended by the fire department itself. The property manager, a tired man named Greg, said he'd note it in the file but that ultimately the board, meaning Karen, had final say on aesthetics. I wrote Karen a polite email attaching my county permit, the fire department's plant list, and photos of the completed defensible space inspection. She replied 2 days later with a single line, noted. The board will discuss at the next meeting. I should have realized then that discuss meant something else entirely. At that meeting, Karen framed my fire break as a precedent problem. If she let me keep wild, unkempt brush along my fence line, she argued, every homeowner would start ignoring the landscaping palette. Nadia pointed out, gently, that fire safety wasn't really comparable to paint colors. Karen cut her off before she finished. The board voted 3-2 to issue a formal violation, with Nadia and one other member dissenting. I later learned that 2 of the yes votes belonged to people whose driveways Karen's cousin had recently repaved for free, a detail that meant nothing to me yet, but that I'd remember later. The fine was $250 a month until compliance, which in Karen's words meant removing the barrier and replacing it with something from her approved palette, meaning ornamental grasses that, ironically, were more flammable than anything I'd planted. I paid the first fine and kept the barrier exactly as it was. Marcus wanted to just rip it out and avoid the fight, but something in me refused. I hadn't spent my kitchen remodel money and half a summer coordinating with the fire department to tear it out because one woman didn't like the color of sage against white gravel. This was never about aesthetics for me. The small conflict became a real one on a Tuesday in June. When I came home to find a second notice, this one threatening to place a lien on our house if the fines went unpaid for another 60 days. I'd never had a lien threat over a hedge before. My hands were shaking when I read it. I called an emergency meeting with Nadia over coffee, and she admitted something that made my stomach drop. Liens over landscaping disputes were almost unheard of in the HOA's history, except once, 3 years earlier, against Ruth Delgado, right before Ruth quietly sold her house and moved out of state. That night, I pulled every HOA newsletter and meeting minute I could find online, cross-referencing names. Karen's cousin, Chad Prescott, ran a landscaping company that had won every major HOA contract for 2 years running. The entrance gates, the community pool deck, the approved plant nursery partnership everyone was pushed toward buying from. It wasn't proof of anything illegal. HOA boards hire relatives all the time, technically within the rules if disclosed. But nothing in the meeting minutes mentioned a disclosure, and Nadia said she'd never seen one filed. It was the first thread of something bigger, and I pulled it gently, not wanting to snap it. I decided to fight the fine through the HOA's own appeal process instead of escalating right away. I submitted my county fire permit, a signed letter from Inspector Torres confirming the barrier met defensible space code, and a request that the board review Section 4.2 against California's state fire mitigation law, which overrides local aesthetic rules. The appeal hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving Karen plenty of time to prepare. She showed up with a printed binder of her own, full of photos comparing my wild barrier to neighbors' manicured yards, captioned with words like eyesore and safety hazard. Ironic, given what the barrier actually protected against. During the hearing, I calmly read Inspector Torres's letter aloud, stating in plain terms that the plants I'd installed were specifically selected to reduce ember ignition risk and complied with County Ordinance 14.6, which took precedence over any conflicting HOA covenant. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down an inch. "This isn't a fire station," she said, her voice sharpening for the first time in public. "This is a residential community with standards, and those standards exist for a reason." A few board members nodded along, but I noticed Nadia writing something down, and another member, Mr. Say, quietly shaking his head. The board tabled the vote instead of overturning the fine, which felt like a small, cowardly victory for Karen. No resolution, just more waiting, more fines accumulating in the meantime. I left that meeting angrier than I'd been in years, but also more certain than ever that I was right to keep the barrier. 2 weeks later, Mr. Osei stopped me in the driveway and told me something that reframed everything. He'd been on the board when Ruth Delgado clashed with Karen, and Ruth's dispute, he said, had also started over landscaping, before it escalated into something about the reserve fund that no one ever explained publicly. "She just left," he said, shaking his head. "One day she's fighting Karen at every meeting. Next month her house is for sale and she's gone. Never said goodbye to anybody." He didn't know where Ruth had moved. Nobody did. Well, that shouldn't have unsettled me as much as it did. I tried searching for Ruth online that night and found almost nothing. A deactivated social media account, an old real estate listing for her house. It was as if she'd deliberately scrubbed herself from the internet after leaving Ridgeview. I told myself it wasn't my business. I didn't fully believe that even as I thought it. The fines kept coming, now up to 4 months' worth. Nearly $1,000 I refused to pay on principle. Marcus started getting nervous about the lien threat actually going through, worried it could affect our mortgage refinancing. I understood his fear, but backing down felt like proving Karen right about something that wasn't true. I requested copies of the HOA's official meeting minutes going back 2 years, which residents are legally entitled to under our state's homeowner association transparency laws. Greg, the property manager, stalled for 3 weeks before finally sending a heavily redacted PDF, with entire sections about vendor contracts blacked out for privacy reasons. That redaction told me more than the document itself could have. I forwarded it to Nadia, who admitted she'd never seen those particular pages redacted before, meaning someone had gone back and edited records after the fact, which, if true, wasn't just petty landscaping politics anymore. It was something closer to fraud. I started keeping a folder: permits, emails, fine notices, screenshots of Karen's texts to the group chat calling my yard an embarrassment to responsible homeowners. I didn't know yet what I'd use it for. I just knew, instinctively, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually changes color. Karen escalated in a different direction that week, sending a mass email to the entire HOA distribution list, 62 households, naming our address specifically and calling my landscaping a documented fire hazard endangering neighboring properties. It was the opposite of true, and she knew it because I'd shown her the fire inspector's letter myself. Neighbors I barely knew started leaving comments on the community Facebook group, some defending me, most simply repeating Karen's framing without question. Because why would their HOA president lie about something as serious as fire safety? The irony was suffocating. I was being publicly shamed for the one thing I'd done responsibly. Lily came home from a friend's house upset because another kid had told her our yard was on the news for being dangerous. A garbled version of the Facebook thread reaching 3rd graders somehow. That was the moment my anger stopped being abstract. This wasn't about hedges anymore. It was about my daughter. I emailed Karen directly, asking her to correct the public record and remove the post, attaching the fire permit again for what felt like the 10th time. Her response came fast. I'm not obligated to take direction from a resident under active violation. She'd stopped pretending this was about policy. It was personal now. That night, lying awake, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight Karen quietly through appeals and polite emails anymore. I was going to document everything, follow every rule perfectly, and wait for her to make a mistake big enough that even her allies on the board couldn't ignore it. I didn't wait long. The next escalation came through certified mail, a formal notice of intent to lien on our property, citing 11 months of unpaid fines that had somehow ballooned with late fees to over $3,000. Marcus's face went pale reading it. A lien could complicate our mortgage, our credit, everything we'd built here. I called a real estate attorney a coworker recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena Marsh who specialized in HOA disputes. She read through my folder in 20 minutes and told me something that steadied my nerves for the first time in weeks. My defensible space barrier was very likely legally untouchable. Elena explained that under our state's wildfire mitigation statute, passed after a string of catastrophic fires, HOAs were explicitly barred from fining or forcing removal of vegetation installed to comply with local fire agency defensible space requirements. My barrier wasn't a violation. It was protected activity. Full stop. Regardless of what Karen's palate said. They can't lien you for this, Elena said. And if they try, we sue for wrongful lien and attorney's fees. I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in months. I asked her to draft a formal cease and desist letter, citing the statute directly and send it to the HOA's attorney. Karen's response to the cease and desist wasn't backing down. It was fury. Nadia texted me a photo of an email Karen had sent the board, forwarded by mistake to the whole distribution list before being recalled too late, calling me that woman weaponizing lawyers against her own community. I saved a screenshot immediately. The board held an emergency closed session after that. Nadia wasn't invited to despite being treasurer, which she found deeply strange. When she asked Greg, the property manager, why, he mumbled something about executive matters and wouldn't meet her eyes. Something was happening that even Karen's own allies weren't being told about. 2 days later, the HOA's actual attorney sent Elena a short, clipped letter withdrawing the lien threat without prejudice, citing the state statute Elena had raised. It was a legal win, technically, but Karen's public campaign against me on the neighborhood Facebook group didn't stop. If anything, it got worse and more personal. She started commenting on unrelated posts with digs about certain residents who think the rules don't apply to them, and organized an informal neighborhood beautification walk that conspicuously routed past my house, with attendees photographing my fence line like tourists at a crime scene. I watched from my window, arms crossed, saying nothing. Mr. He resigned from the walk halfway through, later telling me he felt sick participating in what was obviously a shaming tour disguised as community spirit. He wasn't the only one uncomfortable. Several neighbors told me privately they thought Karen had crossed a line, even if they wouldn't say so publicly. That private support meant something, but it didn't stop the fines, which the board reinstated a week later under a different code section, this time citing excessive shrub height instead of unapproved species, a transparent workaround of the statute Elena had cited. Karen was learning to route around the law instead of accepting it. Elena wasn't fooled. Out that height restrictions couldn't be selectively enforced against defensible space plantings while identical or taller ornamental. Hedges elsewhere in the neighborhood went unsighted, a pattern that, if it continued, would start to look like targeted harassment rather than neutral rule enforcement. The board tabled that fine too, quietly, without ever formally rescinding it, leaving it hanging over us like an unresolved threat they could revive whenever convenient. It was exhausting, this constant low-grade war fought through certified letters and passive-aggressive Facebook comments, but I refused to let exhaustion turn into surrender. I kept the barrier exactly as it was. Around this time, I ran into Ruth Delgado's old next-door neighbor at the grocery store, a retired teacher named Pat who still lived on Ruth's old street. When I mentioned the HOA drama, Pat's face changed. Karen went after Ruth too, she said quietly. Except Ruth's fight wasn't about plants. It was about missing money. Pat told me Ruth had raised questions at a board meeting about a discrepancy in the reserve fund. Money allocated for a retaining wall repair that never actually got built, even though the budget showed it as completed. Ruth pushed for an independent audit. Weeks later, Ruth was suddenly facing her own wave of violation notices. She caved, Pat said. Sold the house at a loss just to get away from it. Never even had a going-away party. That's not like Ruth. I thanked Pat and drove home with my hands tight on the wheel, thinking about how similar the pattern sounded to what was happening to me right now. I told Nadia everything Pat had said, and her face went pale in a way I hadn't seen before. She admitted that the retaining wall project Ruth had questioned was, in fact, still listed in this year's budget as completed, a line item Nadia herself had never been able to verify with actual receipts. Nadia agreed to quietly start pulling financial records under her authority as treasurer, careful not to tip Karen off before she had something concrete. I offered to help cross-reference dates and vendor names using the redacted minutes I already had. For the first time, this didn't feel like just my fight anymore. Meanwhile, fire season was approaching fast, and the county issued its annual red flag warning bulletin earlier than usual that year, citing an unusually dry spring and dead fuel loads throughout the canyon. Inspector Torres sent a community-wide notice urging every household bordering wildland to review and maintain defensible space before peak season hit. I forwarded that notice to the HOA board, hoping it might finally shift the conversation toward actual fire safety instead of aesthetics. Karen's reply, visible to the whole board, was brief and dismissive. Noted. This does not change the community's landscaping standards. I stared at that sentence for a long time. It occurred to me then that Karen genuinely didn't understand, or didn't care, what living against a wildland boundary actually meant. Her house sat safely in the interior of the neighborhood, buffered by 2 rows of homes between her and the brushland. My family's house was on the front line. Her rules could get us killed. I brought this exact argument to the next open board meeting, standing to speak during public comment for the first time. I laid out the topography, the red flag warning, the statute, everything, as calmly as I could manage. Several neighbors in the audience nodded along. Karen's expression stayed flat, unreadable, dangerous in its stillness. "We appreciate your passion," she said afterward, in the tone adults use with overly emotional children. "But this board has to think about the whole community, not just one household's personal fears." A woman 2 rows behind me muttered "unbelievable" loud enough for half the room to hear. Karen pretended not to notice. That meeting ended without any resolution. But it did something else. It made my situation visible to the wider neighborhood in a way Karen's Facebook smear campaign never had. People who'd only heard her version started approaching me afterward, asking genuine questions, looking at my barrier with new eyes instead of Karen's borrowed judgment. One of those people was a young father named Josh who'd moved in 8 months earlier and hadn't known any of the fire history. When I explained the 2019 fire and the 2022 spot fire, he went home that same week and started researching his own defensible space options. Karen would not be pleased. Sure enough, within days, Karen sent another mass email, this time explicitly discouraging residents from unauthorized landscaping changes inspired by isolated incidents. A not-so-subtle warning aimed at anyone considering following my example. It was the first time I fully understood that Karen wasn't just defending an aesthetic. She was defending control itself. Nadia's quiet financial digging picked up pace that same week. She found an invoice from Chad Prescott's landscaping company for emergency retaining wall stabilization, dated the same month Ruth had raised her original questions, for an amount nearly double the market rate Nadia found from 2 competing quotes she requested anonymously. More troubling, the invoice's project address didn't match the retaining wall's actual location. It listed a different lot number entirely, one that, when Nadia looked it up, belonged to Karen's own backyard. The community's shared reserve fund had apparently paid, in part, for landscaping work on Karen's private property. Nadia didn't tell anyone else yet, worried about tipping Karen off before there was enough evidence to act. She photographed every document instead of removing originals, careful not to give Karen any excuse to accuse her of theft or tampering. I admired her patience more than I could say at the time. I focused on my own front, quietly getting a second, formal fire inspection scheduled with Inspector Torres, wanting an updated, dated, notarized report confirming the barrier's continued compliance heading into peak fire season. Torres agreed readily, telling me he'd actually cited my property before as an example during a training session for new inspectors. That comment stuck with me. It was, according to an actual fire professional, a model example of what defensible space should look like. Karen had spent months publicly humiliating me over something a county expert used to teach other inspectors. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. The new inspection report arrived a week later, glowing, thorough, and dated just 3 weeks before the county's red flag season officially began. I filed it, made copies for Elena, and waited, sensing that the ground beneath this entire conflict was shifting in a direction Karen hadn't anticipated and couldn't yet see coming. For a stretch of about 2 weeks, things went quiet. No new fines, no mass emails, no beautification walks past my house. Marcus joked that maybe Karen had finally given up. I didn't believe it for a second. In my experience, people like Karen don't retreat quietly. They regroup and come back sharper. I used the lull to spend time with Lily, taking her hiking along the fire road behind our neighborhood, pointing out the blackened stumps still visible from the 2019 fire years later. I wanted her to understand why the barrier mattered, not as an abstract argument, but as something she could see and touch. Marcus's shifts eased up too, giving us actual evenings together for the first time in months. We sat on the back porch watching the sunset behind the canyon ridge, the manzanita and sage catching gold light, and for a moment the whole exhausting fight felt worth it. This was what I'd been protecting. Nadia used the quiet period to keep gathering financial records, slowly building a timeline connecting Chad Prescott's invoices, Karen's backyard renovations, and the mysterious completed retaining wall project that, as far as anyone could tell, still didn't physically exist anywhere on the property it was supposedly built on. She found a second suspicious invoice. This one for Community Entrance Landscaping Refresh, dated the same week Karen had hosted a widely photographed garden party at her own house, featuring, according to the photos, freshly planted Italian cypress trees identical to ones Nadia had seen listed on the invoice's material breakdown. Elena, when I updated her, cautioned patience. Financial misconduct allegations needed to be airtight before going public. She said, or Karen could spin the whole thing as a personal vendetta from disgruntled residents. We needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away with Karen's practiced, unbothered smile. We didn't know it would come from fire. The lull ended with a heat wave. Temperatures climbed into the triple digits for 6 straight days, humidity dropping into the single digits. Exactly the conditions Inspector Torres had warned about months earlier. The county issued a full red flag warning, the most severe fire danger classification, covering our entire canyon zone. Local news ran segments every night about evacuation routes and defensible space, the same images of the 2019 fire replaying on a loop. I checked my barrier every morning before work, making sure irrigation lines were functioning, dead material cleared, everything exactly as it needed to be if the worst actually happened. Karen, notably, said nothing publicly about fire safety during the red flag warning. No community email. No reminder to residents about clearing brush. Her silence felt deliberate, almost petty, as if acknowledging the danger publicly would mean acknowledging she'd spent months punishing the one household actually prepared for it. Nadia mentioned that Karen had been unusually absent from the neighborhood group chat during the heat wave, which struck her as odd given how compulsively Karen normally posted. When Nadia asked Greg if everything was all right, he said only that Karen was dealing with some personal landscaping matters at her own property. I didn't think much of that comment at the time, distracted by the heat and the daily fire updates. Looking back, it was the first small thread of the biggest twist still to come, dropped so casually neither of us registered its weight. Karen's own yard, turned out, was not what it appeared to be. The heat wave broke after nearly a week, but the fire danger didn't. Fuel moisture readings stayed critically low, and the county extended the red flag warning through the following weekend. Inspector Torres sent another community notice, this one blunter than the last, urging immediate compliance from any household bordering open brushland. That notice landed in every HOA inbox, including Karen's. Whatever she was dealing with at her own property, she couldn't ignore fire officials forever. 2 days later, without any warning to me at all, a landscaping crew showed up at my house while I was at work, and everything changed in one afternoon. I got the call from a neighbor, Josh, the young father who'd started his own defensible space research months earlier. His text just said, "Dana, are you home? There are guys tearing out your backyard hedges." I called Marcus immediately, then sped home, my hands cold despite the 90-degree heat outside. By the time I pulled into the driveway, half my barrier was already gone, the manzanita uprooted, the sage stripped down to bare dirt, irrigation lines torn out and coiled uselessly on the ground. A man in a Prescott landscaping polo shirt was operating a small excavator along my back fence line. I ran over screaming for him to stop, and he did, looking genuinely confused. He told me he'd been dispatched by the HOA with written authorization to remove unapproved, code-violating vegetation from my property, showing me a printed work order with Karen's signature at the bottom. Dated that morning. No notice to me whatsoever. I called Elena from the driveway, my voice shaking so badly she had to ask me to repeat myself twice. She told me to get everything on video immediately, the destroyed barrier, the work order, the crew, all of it, and to call the sheriff's non-emergency line to report unauthorized destruction of private property. Neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the excavator noise, filming on their phones exactly like the newsletter opening had promised. Josh stood beside me, visibly furious, telling anyone who'd listened that the HOA had just torn out fire-safe landscaping in the middle of an active red flag warning. A sheriff's deputy arrived within 20 minutes, reviewed the work order, and told the crew to stop immediately, explaining that HOA authorization didn't override property rights without proper legal process, especially with an active cease and desist letter from my attorney already on file with the association's own lawyer. The crew foreman, to his credit, apologized directly to me, saying he'd had no idea there was any legal dispute attached to the job. He'd simply been told it was routine landscaping cleanup approved by the board president. He hadn't been told anything about fire code, county permits, or ongoing litigation. I asked him who specifically had given the order, and he pulled out his phone, showing me a text thread with Karen herself. Sent that same morning. Handle the Whitfield property today while she's at work. Full removal. Don't wait for a response. My stomach turned reading my own name typed so coldly. That timestamp mattered enormously. It proved Karen had deliberately scheduled the destruction for a time she knew I'd be away, specifically to avoid confrontation and prevent me from stopping it in progress. This wasn't a rule enforcement gone slightly wrong. It was a calculated, timed act. And now there was written proof. I photographed everything, the bare dirt, the severed irrigation lines, the torn root balls of plants that had taken 2 years to establish, the work order, the text thread the foreman let me screenshot. Elena told me to send it all immediately, saying flatly, "This just went from a dispute to a lawsuit." Marcus arrived home 15 minutes later, and I watched his face shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet, controlled rage I'd rarely seen from him. He stood at the edge of our stripped-bare fence line for a long moment before saying, "She's not getting away with this. Not this time." That evening, once the crew and the deputy had gone, I sat on my back porch staring at the wreckage of 2 years of careful, permitted, expert-guided work, gone in under 3 hours. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, strangely, it felt like the moment the entire fight finally turned in my favor, because Karen hadn't just violated HOA process, ignored a cease and desist letter, and destroyed property without notice. She had done it during an active county red flag fire warning, stripping mandated defensible space from a home bordering wildland, at the exact moment fire officials were begging residents to reinforce exactly that kind of barrier. I called Inspector Torres directly that night, still shaking, and explained what had happened. His tone changed almost instantly from sympathetic to serious. "During an active red flag warning?" he repeated. "That's not just an HOA dispute anymore, Mrs. Whitfield. And I need to see this myself." He came out first thing the next morning, walking the bare fence line slowly, photographing the torn irrigation lines and exposed dirt, shaking his head the entire time. "This was compliant space," he said quietly. "Now it's a bare, exposed slope with dead root debris sitting right where embers would land first." He explained that removing established defensible space during a declared fire emergency, without replacing it with anything, actively increased ignition risk to my home and, by extension, to neighboring properties down the ridge. It wasn't just my problem anymore. It was a documented public safety hazard, created deliberately, with a paper trail. Torres told me he'd be filing an official incident report with the county fire marshal's office, and that given the circumstances an HOA authorized removal during an active red flag warning, the matter would likely be escalated beyond a routine code violation. I didn't fully understand yet what that word, escalated, would come to mean. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. Josh had posted his video of the excavator to the community Facebook group with the caption, "This is what our HOA president did during a red flag warning." And by that afternoon it had more comments than any post in the group's history. Some residents defended Karen reflexively, insisting there had to be an explanation, that surely their HOA president wouldn't authorize something so reckless. Others, especially anyone who'd dealt with her personally over the years, weren't surprised at all. "Mr. Lee, ask her about Ruth Delgado while you're at it." That comment lit a second fire under the thread entirely, as neighbors who remembered Ruth's abrupt departure years earlier started connecting dots publicly for the first time, asking questions Karen had never had to answer before because no one had ever compared notes this openly. The group chat became something closer to an investigation. Karen, notably, went silent on the thread entirely, not defending herself, not explaining, not even her usual passive-aggressive deflections. Nadia texted me that Karen had also gone quiet in the private board chat, which felt less like calm and more like someone quietly calculating how much damage control was still possible. I spent that evening drafting a formal complaint with Elena's help, addressed to both the HOA's governing attorney and the county fire marshal's office, laying out the entire timeline, the original permit, the fines, the cease and desist, the text message ordering removal while I was at work. Everything in careful, documented order. Elena also filed for an emergency restraining order preventing any further HOA action against my property pending review, which the court granted within 2 days given the fire safety documentation attached. For the first time in nearly a year, Karen legally could not touch my property again without facing contempt charges. That same week, Nadia finally decided the financial evidence she'd gathered was solid enough to bring forward, timing it deliberately alongside the fire marshal's involvement. So the two threads, reckless fire code violation and possible financial misconduct, would land together instead of letting Karen manage them one crisis at a time. She requested an emergency, open board meeting, citing her authority as treasurer to demand a financial review given irregularities discovered in reserve fund allocation. Karen tried to delay it, citing a scheduling conflict, but enough board members, rattled by the fire marshal's involvement, overruled her and set the meeting for that Thursday. Word of the meeting spread fast, and by Thursday evening the community clubhouse was packed beyond capacity, residents standing along the walls, spilling out into the parking lot with the doors propped open. I'd never seen turnout like it for an HOA meeting. Everyone wanted to hear what Nadia had found. Karen arrived exactly on time, dressed sharply, composed in a way that almost impressed me given the circumstances, greeting people at the door like nothing at all was wrong. I recognized that composure now for what it actually was, not innocence, but practice. She'd clearly navigated crises like this before. With Ruth, Nadia opened the meeting by presenting a timeline of invoices from Prescott Landscaping, comparing project addresses against actual completed work, showing the discrepancy between the retaining wall repair, billed to the reserve fund, and the landscaping improvements that had actually appeared at Karen's private residence around the same dates. A murmur rolled through the room as Nadia clicked to the next slide, showing the entrance refresh invoice alongside photos from Karen's own garden party. The Italian cypress trees clearly visible and clearly matching the material list. Someone near the back said, "Loud enough to carry. That's literally in her backyard." Karen finally spoke, her voice tight but controlled, insisting the invoices reflected bundled community projects that included incidental work at board members, properties as part of broader contracts. An explanation that made even her strongest remaining supporter, a woman named Diane, visibly wince at how thin it sounded out loud. Mr. Next. Unprompted, and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in the room the entire meeting. Is this what happened to Ruth Delgado? Did she find the same thing? And you buried her fines under a lien until she left instead of answering for it. The room went completely silent. Karen's composure finally cracked. Just slightly, a tightening around her eyes before she said, flatly, that Ruth's departure had nothing to do with any of this, and was a private matter she wasn't at liberty to discuss. Nobody in that room believed her, and I could see it on every face. I stood up then, for the first time speaking directly in front of the entire packed room instead of just the board, and calmly recounted my own timeline, the permit, the fines, the cease and desist, the text message ordering my barrier's removal while I was at work during an active red flag fire warning. I finished by reading Inspector Torres's quote aloud, word for word from his incident report, that the removal had created a documented, elevated fire ignition risk to the property and surrounding homes. The room reacted audibly, a mix of gasps and angry murmuring directed squarely at the woman standing at the podium. Karen tried to pivot, insisting the landscaping crew had misunderstood the scope of the work order, and that any fire safety concerns were an unfortunate miscommunication, not intentional. But the time-stamped text message, sent while I was at work, explicit about avoiding my response, undercut that excuse before she even finished saying it. A board member who'd previously sided with Karen on nearly every vote, a quiet man named Walt, raised his hand and asked to see the text message himself. When I read it aloud again, his expression changed entirely. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting, but he didn't look at Karen again either. Diane, Karen's remaining vocal supporter, made one last attempt to defend her, arguing the community shouldn't tear down a dedicated volunteer over a few paperwork misunderstandings. Nadia calmly responded that misappropriating reserve funds and ordering unauthorized destruction of fire protective property during a state of emergency wasn't a paperwork misunderstanding. It was a pattern. The board voted, right there, to suspend Karen's presidency pending a full independent financial audit and formal review by the county. A motion that passed 5-1, with only Diane dissenting. Karen sat frozen for a moment before standing abruptly, saying the board would regret undermining her leadership, and walking out. The meeting didn't end so much as dissolve into stunned conversation. Neighbors turning to each other, comparing notes, some visibly relieved, others visibly furious they hadn't questioned things sooner. I stood there in the middle of it, exhausted, still smelling faintly of the torn-up dirt from my own backyard 2 days earlier. Elena called that night, having heard secondhand from Nadia how the meeting had gone. She warned me this wasn't over yet. A suspended presidency and an internal audit weren't the same as legal consequences, and Karen, cornered, might not simply accept defeat quietly. She was right to warn me. Karen wasn't done. 2 days later, Karen filed her own countersuit against me, absurdly alleging that my unauthorized fire barrier had actually caused property value damage to the neighborhood, and that my public statements at the meeting constituted defamation against her character. Elena read the filing and actually laughed out loud on the phone with me. "This is going to backfire on her spectacularly," Elena said, "because now everything she said gets entered into discovery, under oath, including that text message." Karen, was so used to controlling the narrative through fines and quiet intimidation that she genuinely didn't understand what a real legal fight would expose. Meanwhile, the county fire marshal's office formally opened an investigation into the removal of my defensible space barrier during the red flag warning, treating it as a potential violation of the state's wildfire mitigation statute, the same one Elena had cited months earlier, carrying real financial penalties, not just HOA fines. Inspector Torres testified in an early statement that Karen's authorized removal had left my property in a materially more dangerous condition than before, directly contradicting her countersuit's claim that my barrier had somehow damaged the neighborhood. Every piece of evidence Karen tried to weaponize kept turning around and pointing straight back at her. The independent financial audit began the following week. Led by an outside accountant, Nadia had insisted on hiring specifically because he had no connections to anyone in Ridgeview. Within days, he confirmed what Nadia had already suspected. Over $11,000 in reserve funds had been redirected toward projects at Karen's private residence. The auditor also found something Nadia hadn't uncovered yet. A pattern of Chad Prescott's invoices being approved without competitive bidding, in direct violation of the HOA's own procurement bylaws, a rule Karen herself had cited against other vendors just 18 months earlier when a different resident had proposed hiring her own landscaper. That hypocrisy detail spread through the neighborhood group chat almost gleefully. Residents screenshotting Karen's old messages enforcing competitive bidding rules against everyone except herself. It was a small thing compared to the fire safety violation, but it captured something essential about who Karen had been this entire time. Underneath the polished exterior, with the audit results public and the fire marshal's investigation active, Karen shifted from defense to something more desperate. She began calling individual board members privately, according to Walt, who told me directly, trying to pressure them into reversing the suspension vote, hinting she knew things about several members' own minor rule violations. Walt refused, telling her plainly that threatening board members wasn't going to undo what the audit had already found. He said her voice had changed entirely on that call, no longer composed, no longer measured, but sharp and almost panicked. A version of Karen none of us had heard in 2 years of meetings. Karen's next move was even more reckless. She showed up at my house unannounced one evening, standing in my driveway demanding I drop the lawsuit and tell people it was all a misunderstanding, insisting that if the audit and fire marshal investigation continued, she could lose her real estate license, her reputation, everything. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't caused any of this. She had. The moment she signed a work order to destroy my property while I was at work during a fire emergency. She stood there a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something like real fear in her face. "You don't understand what you're doing to me," she said, voice cracking slightly. I almost felt a flicker of pity. Then I remembered Ruth Delgado, who'd vanished from her own community rather than face this same woman, and the pity evaporated completely. "I understand exactly what you did to my family," I said, and closed the door. That confrontation, unfortunately for Karen, had been witnessed by my neighbor across the street, who'd been watering her lawn the entire time and later gave a statement to Elena, describing Karen's visit as aggressive and intimidating, language that would matter significantly once the restraining order violation claim was filed the following morning. Elena moved fast, filing a motion citing Karen's driveway confrontation as a direct violation of the existing restraining order barring further action against me or my property. The judge granted an expedited hearing, clearly unimpressed by the pattern of behavior laid out in Elena's filing, referencing the fire marshal's report explicitly. Karen's desperation escalated further before that hearing even happened. Nadia called me late one night, her voice tight with alarm, saying Karen had shown up at the HOA management office demanding Greg hand over and destroy the original signed work order for my property, the one with her own signature and timestamp. Greg, to his credit, refused, later telling Nadia he'd felt genuinely unsettled by how insistent Karen had been, practically begging him to shred the document. He photographed it himself that same night, on his personal phone, and quietly forwarded copies to both Nadia and Elena, unprompted, clearly sensing which way this was heading. That attempted document destruction, once revealed, transformed the entire situation yet again. This wasn't just reckless landscaping decisions or financial mismanagement anymore. Attempting to destroy evidence in an active fire marshal investigation and pending litigation was, according to Elena, potentially criminal obstruction. A phrase that made even Marcus go quiet when I told him. Inspector Torres's investigation, meanwhile, had expanded beyond just my property. Prompted by the public attention, several other residents came forward describing their own defensible space plans being blocked or discouraged by Karen over the previous 2 years, revealing a pattern far larger than one dispute over one backyard barrier. One resident, an elderly widower named Frank, whose property also bordered the wildland edge, admitted he'd abandoned his own fire mitigation plans entirely after. Karen threatened him with escalating fines nearly identical to mine, choosing instead to simply live with the risk rather than fight a battle he assumed he'd lose. Frank's statement, given voluntarily to Torres's investigators, painted a picture of an HOA president who had systematically discouraged legitimate, counter-recommended fire safety measures across an entire wildfire-prone community, not out of ignorance, but seemingly to protect her own narrow aesthetic vision regardless of the actual danger involved. That detail landed hardest with residents who'd previously stayed neutral. The idea that Karen's campaign against my barrier wasn't an isolated overreaction but part of a pattern actively endangering multiple households. The community Facebook group, once split in its sympathies, tipped decisively against her within days of Frank's story circulating. Karen requested, through a newly hired attorney, a meeting with the county fire marshal's office to clarify misunderstandings about her role. But Torres declined, stating the investigation had progressed beyond the point where informal clarification meetings were appropriate, and that any further statements needed to come through formal, recorded channels. That refusal alone told the neighborhood everything it needed to know about how seriously the county was treating this. Karen wasn't dealing with an annoyed homeowner and an HOA board anymore. She was dealing with an active fire marshal investigation with the authority to issue real citations, real fines, potentially real criminal referrals. Marcus and I spent that week slowly, carefully replanting our barrier, this time with Inspector Torres personally supervising the installation, documenting every step for the official record. Felt strange, planting the same shrubs a second time, but also strangely powerful, watching something Karen had destroyed rebuilt under direct county protection. Neighbors started stopping by unprompted while we worked, some helping haul mulch, others just watching, a few visibly emotional about how far things had escalated from what should have been a simple conversation about hedges. Josh brought his young son over to help plant, telling him, "This is what standing your ground looks like." Karen, isolated now from most of the board and facing mounting legal exposure on multiple fronts, made one final attempt at controlling the narrative, releasing a lengthy public statement.
On the neighborhood Facebook group insisting she'd always prioritized community safety.
The statement backfired almost instantly. Dozens of residents who'd never spoken up before began commenting with their own experiences. Unfair fines, selectively enforced rules, the sudden departure of Ruth Delgado years earlier, turning what Karen intended as damage control into an open, public accounting of 2 years of quiet grievances. Ruth Delgado herself, astonishingly, saw the thread. Someone had tagged a mutual friend who still followed Ruth online, and Ruth, breaking her years-long silence. Posted a single comment. I left because I couldn't afford to keep fighting her and the board she controlled. I'm glad someone finally could. It was the twist nobody expected. That comment exploded through the neighborhood overnight. Screenshotted and shared everywhere, confirming what Mr. Jose and Pat had only hinted at for months. Ruth followed up by direct messaging Nadia directly, offering to share her own old documentation of fines and reserve fund questions from years before Karen's cousin's invoices had even started. Nadia forwarded everything to the auditor and to Elena, who said the pattern evidence, spanning multiple years and multiple victims, would be devastating in any legal proceeding. What had started as one woman's fight over a fire barrier had become documented proof of a years-long pattern of intimidation, financial misconduct, and retaliation. Karen's attorney, according to Elena, reached out that week attempting to negotiate a quiet settlement, dropping her countersuit against me, covering the cost of replanting my barrier, and resigning from the board entirely, in exchange for the fire marshal's office agreeing not to pursue further citations. It was, essentially, a surrender dressed up as negotiation. Elena advised me the fire marshal's investigation wasn't something I actually controlled or could bargain away, and that Karen's team likely knew that too, using the settlement offer more as a public relations move than a genuine legal solution. I told Elena I wasn't interested in any deal that let Karen quietly disappear without accountability. That decision wasn't just about me anymore. Ruth had lost her home over this. Frank had abandoned his own family's fire safety out of fear. An unknown amount of community money had funded Karen's private landscaping. A quiet settlement would have let all of that vanish along with her resignation letter. I told Elena to proceed with the lawsuit regardless of any settlement offer. Focus specifically on the unauthorized destruction of property and the documented fire safety endangerment. Elena filed accordingly, and news of the ongoing legal action, combined with Ruth's public statement, kept the story circulating well beyond just our small neighborhood group chat. A local news station picked up the story that week, running a segment on HOA overreach in wildfire zones, using our neighborhood as a case study, interviewing Inspector Torres, who spoke plainly on camera about the dangers of HOAs overriding fire code in high-risk areas. Karen declined to comment for the segment. The broadcast reached a wider audience than any of us expected. And suddenly Ridgeview Estates wasn't just a neighborhood dealing with a difficult HOA president. It was a cautionary example being discussed by fire safety advocates and homeowner rights groups across the state, with several reporters reaching out to Elena for follow-up interviews. Karen, watching her carefully cultivated reputation collapse in real time, made one last, genuinely reckless move. Nadia called me in a panic one afternoon saying Karen had been seen near my property again. This time with a camera, apparently trying to photograph evidence that my rebuilt barrier was somehow still non-compliant. I called the sheriff's department immediately given the active restraining order, and a deputy arrived to find Karen standing at the edge of my property line, camera in hand, insisting she had every right to document ongoing violations for the board's records, despite no longer having any official authority on the board at all. The deputy explained, patiently but firmly, that the restraining order barred her from approaching my property for any reason, official capacity or not, and that continuing to do so constituted a clear violation subject to arrest. Karen argued for several minutes before finally, reluctantly, getting back in her car and leaving. That confrontation, captured partly on my neighbor's doorbell camera, became the final piece of evidence Elena needed to file for contempt proceedings against Karen for violating the restraining order a second time, a filing that carried the real possibility of actual jail time depending on the judge's ruling. Marcus watched the doorbell footage with me that night, shaking his head slowly. "She had every chance to just stop," he said. "The audit, the investigation, the lawsuit, the restraining order. She kept choosing to make it worse." I didn't have an answer for that, because he was completely right, and it still baffled me. Nadia told me the board had begun formal proceedings to remove Karen from the HOA entirely, not just suspend her presidency, citing the pattern of misconduct, the attempted document destruction, and the repeated restraining order violations as grounds under the association's own bylaws for full expulsion from any leadership role, present or future. By this point, even Diane, Karen's last remaining defender, publicly withdrew her support, posting a brief statement to the community group acknowledging she'd been wrong to give Karen the benefit of the doubt for so long. Felt, finally, like the entire neighborhood had woken up from something at the exact same moment. The county fire marshal's office scheduled a formal hearing to present its findings, inviting both HOA leadership and affected residents to attend, a hearing that would determine whether Karen faced civil citations, referral for criminal charges, or both, based on the full scope of the investigation into her authorization of my barrier's removal. Elena prepared me carefully for that hearing, reviewing every document, every timestamp, every witness statement, making sure my own testimony would be airtight and unshakable under any cross-examination. I hadn't realized how much this entire ordeal had worn on me until I sat rehearsing my own story and felt my hands trembling again. The night before the hearing, couldn't sleep, replaying the entire year in my head, the first violation notice with its passive-aggressive smiley sticker, the bulldozer showing up while I was at work, Ruth's quiet, painful comment breaking her silence online. It felt impossible that all of it led to this single moment. Marcus sat up with me for a while, reminding me gently that regardless of what happened at the hearing, our barrier was standing again, planted under the fire marshal's own supervision, more protected now than it had ever been before Karen touched it. Whatever else happened, that much couldn't be taken away again. Nadia texted late that night too, saying the auditor's final report would be entered into official record at the same hearing, meaning the financial misconduct, findings and the fire safety violation would be considered together for the first time, in front of county officials with actual enforcement authority over both issues. Ruth Delgado, remarkably, reached out directly for the first time, offering to submit a written statement to the hearing describing her own experience years earlier, even though she no longer lived in the state and had nothing left to personally gain from doing so. "Someone should have believed me back then," she wrote. "I believe you now." That message affected me more than almost anything else that had happened. This had never really been just about a hedge, or even just about me. It was about every resident who'd quietly given up, sold their house, stayed silent, or simply learned to live smaller because one person had learned exactly how to weaponize a homeowners association. The morning of the hearing, the community clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Residents arriving early to secure seats, several local reporters setting up cameras outside. Inspector Torres arrived first, carrying a thick binder of documentation, nodding at me with a small, reassuring smile as he passed. Karen arrived separately, flanked by her attorney, wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast morning, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she made her way inside. It struck me how different she looked from the polished, commanding woman who'd once handed out violation notices with cheerful little smiley face stickers just over a year earlier. The hearing opened with Inspector Torres presenting the county's fire safety findings in careful, methodical detail: the original permit, the compliance inspections, the red flag warning, the work order, the time-stamped text message ordering removal while I was at work. Each piece of evidence landed like another nail in an already sealed case. He concluded his testimony by stating plainly that the removal had constituted a documented violation of the state's wildfire mitigation statute, exacerbated by the deliberate timing during an active fire emergency, and recommended the maximum civil penalty allowed under county code, along with formal referral to the district attorney's office for review. A visible ripple went through the room at the phrase, "District Attorney's Office." Karen's attorney immediately requested a brief recess, huddling with her in the hallway for several minutes before returning, Karen's expression noticeably paler than when she'd walked in. Whatever her lawyer had told her clearly wasn't reassuring. The financial auditor testified next, laying out the reserve fund discrepancies in plain, unemotional numbers, invoices for work that never happened at the addresses claimed, unbid contracts awarded to a direct relative, thousands of dollars in community funds that had ultimately, traceably, benefited Karen's own private property renovations. I testified after that, keeping my account as factual and unembellished as possible, letting the timeline itself carry the emotional weight rather than my own anger. When I read the text message aloud one final time, "Handle the Whitfield property today while she's at work," several people in the audience audibly gasped, even though most had already heard it before. Ruth Delgado's written statement was read aloud by the hearing officer, describing her own fines, her own cornered silence, her own decision to simply disappear rather than keep fighting. Hearing her words spoken in that room, finally given weight and attention 2 years too late, brought several people, including me, close to tears. Frank spoke too, quietly, describing how fear of Karen's fines had kept him from protecting his own home for years, a decision he said he deeply regretted now that he understood how legally protected his fire safety plans had actually been the entire time. His voice shook, but he didn't stop until he finished. When Karen's attorney finally rose to offer her defense, the arguments felt thin against everything already laid out. Claims of miscommunication, good intentions, aesthetic concerns, none of it addressing the time-stamped order to act while I was away. None of it addressing the reserve fund discrepancies. None of it addressing Ruth or Frank at all. Karen herself was given the opportunity to speak directly, and for a long moment she simply sat there, staring at the table in front of her, before finally standing and saying, in a voice much smaller than the one I'd grown used to over the past year, "I never meant for anyone to get hurt." It wasn't quite an admission of guilt, but it wasn't a denial either, and something about the sudden smallness of her voice, after months of certified letters, and mass emails and cheerful violation stickers, felt like watching a mask finally slip all the way off in front of the entire community she tried to control. The hearing officer called a recess to deliberate, and the room spilled out into the parking lot in restless, buzzing conversation, everyone replaying what they just witnessed. Nadia found me first, wrapping me in a tight hug, saying simply, It's finally happening. All of it. Finally. In one room. All at once. Reporters approached asking for comment. And I kept my statement brief, saying only that I'd built my barrier to protect my family and my community, and that no one should ever have to fight this hard just to follow the fire department's own safety recommendations. I didn't mention Karen by name once. I didn't need to. We waited nearly 2 hours for the hearing officer to return. The longest 2 hours of the entire ordeal somehow. Longer even than the day the excavator had shown up in my backyard. Marcus held my hand the entire time, occasionally squeezing it. Neither of us saying much. Both of us just waiting. When the hearing officer finally returned, the room fell silent almost instantly, everyone leaning forward at once. She began by addressing the fire safety violation directly, stating that the evidence overwhelmingly supported findings that Karen Prescott had knowingly authorized the removal of legally protected defensible space during an active state fire emergency. The maximum civil penalty was imposed, along with a formal referral to the district attorney's office to evaluate potential criminal charges related to the timing and intent behind the removal, given the documented evidence of deliberate scheduling to avoid confrontation. Karen's attorney's face tightened, but Karen herself barely reacted, as if she'd already expected this. On the financial findings, the hearing officer noted that while full criminal referral on the reserve fund misuse would require separate proceedings, the audit's conclusions would be forwarded to both the district attorney and the state's homeowner association oversight board, which had authority to permanently bar Karen from serving on any HOA board statewide. That last detail landed hard across the room, not just removed from Ridgeview's board, but potentially barred from ever holding this kind of power again anywhere. Karen finally reacted then, her composure cracking fully. Her hand pressed briefly to her mouth before she caught herself and forced her expression back to stillness. The hearing officer closed by directly addressing the community, saying she hoped the outcome would serve as a reminder that homeowners associations, whatever authority they held over paint colors and fence heights, held no authority whatsoever over legally mandated fire safety measures, especially in communities as vulnerable as ours to wildfire. The room erupted into applause the moment she finished. An unusual sound for what had technically been a government hearing, but it felt earned after everything that had led to this room, this morning, this verdict. I sat there, oddly numb, watching Karen and her attorney gather their things and leave without a word to anyone. Outside, in the parking lot, neighbors kept approaching me, some I barely knew, thanking me for not backing down, telling me they'd learned things about their own defensible space rights they'd never understood before. Josh's son asked if the bad lady was in trouble now. I told him yes, and that trouble was fair. The following week, Karen was formally removed from the HOA board entirely through an emergency bylaw vote, stripped of any remaining title or authority, effective immediately. The board also voted unanimously to reverse every fine ever issued against my property, retroactively, along with a formal written apology entered into the permanent HOA record. Nadia was voted in as interim president almost immediately after, a choice the community celebrated with visible relief, given how consistently she'd pushed for transparency and accountability throughout the entire ordeal. Her first official act as president was proposing a community-wide defensible space grant, funded by recovered reserve funds, to help every household comply with fire code. Frank was among the first to apply for that grant, finally installing the fire-resistant barrier he'd abandoned years earlier out of fear. this time with full community support instead of quiet intimidation. He stopped by my house afterward just to say thank you, standing awkwardly on my porch for a moment before simply saying, "You did this." The district attorney's office announced 2 weeks later that it would be pursuing formal charges against Karen related to the deliberate destruction of protected fire safety infrastructure
during a declared emergency, along with separate charges tied to the misappropriation of HOA reserve funds, both classified as significant enough to proceed to full prosecution.
News of the charges spread quickly, and this time the local news segment framed the story very differently than the first, not as a neighborhood dispute anymore, but as a clear-cut case of an HOA official abusing her position, endangering an entire community, and funneling shared resources into her own private property. Karen's house went up for sale less than a month later. A for sale sign appearing quietly one morning with no announcement. No goodbye party. No final Facebook post explaining herself to the neighborhood she'd once tried so hard to control. It felt like watching Ruth Delgado's own quiet departure play out in reverse. I found out later, through Nadia, that Karen had actually been renting out her house to tenants for the past year while living with a relative 2 counties away, technically violating the HOA's own residency requirement for board members, a rule she herself had enforced strictly against another resident just 2 years earlier. That final detail, small compared to everything else, still struck me as fitting somehow. A woman who'd spent years demanding absolute compliance from everyone around her, who hadn't even been living under the rules she policed so aggressively, exposed in the end by the very same standards she'd used to punish other people. Ruth Delgado sent one more message after hearing about the charges and the house sale. This one to me directly rather than posted publicly. "I wish I'd had the resources you had," she wrote. "The lawyer, the fire inspector on your side, the neighbors who finally spoke up. I'm just glad it finally ended." I wrote back telling her none of it would have mattered without her own quiet courage in finally speaking up publicly, breaking a silence she'd kept for 2 painful years. She replied simply, "Some fights you can only really win together." I read that message more than once, sitting alone on my rebuilt back porch. Marcus and I hosted a small gathering that weekend. Nothing official. Just neighbors gathering informally in our backyard around the very barrier that had started this entire ordeal, now fuller and healthier than it had ever been before, planted under actual county supervision, legally untouchable, quietly thriving along our fence line. Josh brought his son again, who ran straight to the manzanita shrubs asking if these were the fire plants, delighted when I confirmed it. Frank came too, describing his own barrier's progress with real pride in his voice. Even Walt showed up, admitting quietly he regretted not questioning Karen sooner in those early meetings. Inspector Torres stopped by briefly, off duty, just to see the finished barrier one more time, saying he intended to use updated photos of it, along with the whole documented story, in future defensible space training sessions for new inspectors and homeowners alike. An ironic full circle to how this had all started. Nadia arrived last, still visibly exhausted from her new duties as interim president, but smiling in a way I hadn't seen from her in months. "The grant applications are already coming in faster than expected," she said. "People actually want to comply now. They just needed to know they were allowed to." Lily spent the evening running between the adults, asking everyone questions about the brave lady from the news, meaning me, a description that made me laugh out loud for the first time in what felt like ages. Marcus caught my eye across the yard and smiled, the kind of tired, relieved smile that says more than words could. As the sun set behind the canyon ridge that evening, painting the manzanita and sage in that same warm gold light I remembered from before any of this began, I found myself thinking not about Karen at all, but about how ordinary this moment felt now. Neighbors, laughter, a barrier standing quietly, doing its job. A few months later, Karen accepted a plea agreement rather than face a full criminal trial, pleading no contest to reckless destruction of protected property and misuse of association funds, receiving a suspended sentence, mandatory restitution to the HOA, and a permanent ban from serving in any homeowners association leadership role statewide. The restitution amount, once finalized, covered not just the cost of replanting my barrier, but a portion returned to the reserve fund for community-wide fire mitigation grants, meaning even her punishment ended up quietly funding the exact kind of defensible space projects she'd spent years trying to block across the neighborhood. I never saw Karen again after the hearing, not even in passing, though Nadia mentioned once hearing she'd moved out of state entirely, settling somewhere far from any HOA board she could ever hope to control again. Part of me hoped, genuinely, that wherever she landed, she'd finally learn something from all of it. Ridgeview Estates itself changed in the months that followed. Not dramatically, but steadily. More households applying for defensible space grants. More open discussion at board meetings. Fewer passive-aggressive violation notices taped to doors with cheerful little stickers. Nadia's leadership brought something the neighborhood had quietly been missing for years. Actual trust. Ruth Delgado, remarkably, reached out one final time that autumn, mentioning she was considering moving back now that the neighborhood felt different. Now that the person who'd driven her away no longer held any power over anyone. I told her, honestly, that her old street would be lucky to have her back. Frank's barrier, fully grown in by the following spring, became something of a neighborhood landmark, residents pointing it out to visitors as proof of what the community had survived and rebuilt together. He told me once, half joking, that he sometimes thought of it as Ruth and Karen's barrier just as much as his own. Looking back now, I think about how easily this could have gone differently, if I'd caved under the fines, if Marcus's worry about the lien had won out, if Nadia hadn't quietly started pulling financial records, if Ruth hadn't finally found the courage to break her silence at exactly the right moment. Every small decision, mine and everyone else's, had mattered in ways none of us fully understood until they all came together in that packed clubhouse. In that hearing room, in that final overwhelming wave of applause. It hadn't been one dramatic confrontation that ended things. It had been dozens of small, stubborn refusals to give up. My barrier still stands today. Taller now, fuller, exactly where it always belonged, doing exactly what it was always meant to do. Some mornings I still walk out to check the irrigation lines, an old habit from the year I fought for every single inch of it, and I still feel that same quiet pride. Lily is older now, old enough to actually understand why the plants along our fence line matter. Why her mother spent a year fighting over what once seemed like just a hedge. Last fire season, she helped me clear dead brush herself, telling me proudly she wanted our house to always be one of the safe ones. Marcus still works nights, still comes home to find me checking fire danger ratings out of old habit. But the anxiety underneath it has softened into something more like careful respect now, rather than the raw fear it used to be. We built something worth protecting, and then we actually protected it. I think sometimes about the version of this story where Karen had simply listened. Back at that very first HOA meeting, when I calmly explained why the barrier mattered. One conversation, handled with basic decency instead of control, could have avoided every fine, every lawsuit, every person hurt along the way, including Karen herself. But that isn't the story that happened, and I've stopped wishing it had been different, because the version that did happen taught this entire neighborhood something far more valuable than a quiet, uneventful compliance ever could have, that rules meant to protect people can't be quietly twisted into tools for controlling them instead. Nadia still leads the board today, having been elected outright rather than just serving as interim, and the community's Defensible Space Grant program has since become a model other HOAs in fire-prone areas reportedly reference when designing their own fire safety policies, an outcome none of us could have predicted that terrible afternoon. Inspector Torres retired last year, but before he did, he told me my case had genuinely changed how his department approached HOA disputes involving fire code, pushing for clearer statewide guidance specifically so no other family would have to fight this hard just to keep their home safe from something as simple as a hedge. I ran into Diane at the grocery store recently, Karen's old defender, and she stopped me to apologize directly, admitting she'd let Karen's confidence convince her something was fine long after it clearly wasn't. I told her it was all right, that plenty of good people get fooled by confidence dressed up as competence. That conversation stuck with me more than I expected, because it captured something true about the whole ordeal. Karen hadn't succeeded through strength or even really through cruelty alone. She'd succeeded, for as long as she had, through sheer unwavering confidence, the kind that makes reasonable people doubt their own clear-eyed judgment. It took an entire community, piece by piece, refusing to keep doubting themselves before that confidence finally cracked under its own weight. Ruth's quiet courage, Nadia's patient audit, Torres's professional authority, Frank's honest fear finally spoken aloud, Josh's simple decision to hit record, none of it alone would have been enough. Together, it was overwhelming. Sometimes new residents ask me, half joking, about the Karen story, having heard some fragmented version of it through the neighborhood grapevine, usually getting some detail wrong in the retelling. I always correct the same one thing: this was never really about a hedge. It was about who gets to decide what safety actually means. I planted one more shrub last spring, at the very edge of my barrier, a small manzanita seedling barely a foot tall, mostly symbolic at this point given how established everything else already is. Lily named it, only half joking, Ruth's bush, insisting it deserved a name after everything that had happened because of it. The name stuck, oddly, and now it's just what we call it. A strange little private joke that somehow honors everyone this fight actually protected: Ruth, Frank, Josh's son, every family bordering that same dry canyon who now knows, clearly and legally, that their fire safety cannot be quietly overruled by anyone's aesthetic preference. On the anniversary of the day the excavator showed up, I don't mark it with anything dramatic, just a quiet walk along the fence line with Marcus and Lily, checking the irrigation, admiring how thoroughly the barrier has recovered and grown beyond what it even was before Karen ever touched it. Marcus asked me once, not long ago, if I regretted how hard I'd fought, given how exhausting that entire year had been. I told him no, without hesitation, because the exhaustion had a shape and a purpose, unlike so many other fights in life. This one, at least, had ended with something solid built. Karen Prescott, as far as anyone in Ridgeview knows, has never returned, never reached out, never resurfaced in any capacity connected to the neighborhood she once tried so completely to control. Her absence, honestly, says more than any apology ever could have. Some people simply move on to find new rules to enforce elsewhere. I hope, wherever she landed, someone there refuses to be quietly bulldozed the way she once tried to bulldoze me, my barrier, and everyone else who ever crossed her without immediately backing down. I hope the next Ruth Delgado finds her voice faster than the real one did, without having to lose her home first. Standing at my fence line now, looking out over the same dry canyon that started all of this, I don't feel triumphant exactly. Not anymore. Months removed from the applause and the headlines. I feel something steadier than that. I feel like someone who protected what mattered and refused to stop, no matter the cost. This barrier was never really about beating Karen. It was about proving, in the end, that a homeowners association, however much petty power it accumulates over paint colors and fence heights, cannot override the basic right of a family to protect their home from fire, no matter how loudly someone insists otherwise. The county now uses our case, informally, as a teaching example in new HOA board member training, a fact Nadia mentioned proudly at a recent meeting, adding that our neighborhood's defensible space compliance rate is now the highest in the entire fire district, a statistic that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. I still keep that original folder, the one I started almost by instinct, full of fines and permits and screenshots, tucked away in a filing cabinet now instead of active use. I've never quite been able to throw it away. Feels like proof, tangible and undeniable, that patience and documentation can outlast intimidation. Ruth Delgado did move back eventually, buying a smaller house 2 streets over from her old one, telling me over coffee that walking past her old house without dread for the first time in years felt like getting something back she genuinely thought was gone for good. We've become close friends since. Frank passed away peacefully last winter, and at his memorial, more than one neighbor mentioned his defensible space barrier specifically, how proud he'd been of it, how he told anyone who'd listened that it represented the year he finally stopped being afraid of his own homeowners association. Felt like a fitting thing to be remembered for. Josh's son is old enough now to explain defensible space to other kids in the neighborhood, having grown up watching this entire saga unfold around him. A strange kind of inheritance passed down not through money or property, but through a genuine understanding that fairness sometimes has to be fought for out loud. The Community Garden Club, revived under Nadia's leadership, now hosts an annual Firewise planting day every spring, helping any household interested in defensible space get expert guidance and discounted native plants. Funded partly by the very restitution money Karen was ordered to pay back after everything finally came out. I helped organize that first planting day myself, standing in the same spot where an excavator had once torn my barrier apart, now surrounded by neighbors digging holes for their own manzanita and sage, laughing, comparing notes, building something protective together instead of being pitted against each other by one person's need for control. Marcus took a photo of me that day, dirt on my knees, shovel in hand, Lily beside me holding a young shrub steady while I packed soil around its roots. Still the background on my phone, a reminder of everything it took to get back to something this simple. A family, protecting their home, together. Some nights, When the wind picks up along the canyon the way it always does before fire season truly arrives, I still walk out to check the barrier one more time before bed, running my hand along the sage, listening to it rustle. It always answers back the same way. Steady. Still standing. The lawsuit Karen filed against me was formally dismissed with prejudice a year later, closing the last remaining legal thread of the entire ordeal, though by then it barely registered as news, overshadowed by everything else that had already happened and healed in the time since. Elena still checks in occasionally, less as my attorney now and more as a friend who happened to walk through an unusually dramatic year of my life alongside me, always ending our calls the same way. You did the hard part. You just kept showing up. I've never forgotten that. The reserve fund, fully restored and carefully audited every year now under Nadia's insistence, has never again been touched for anything resembling personal benefit. A small but permanent structural change born directly out of everything the community endured to finally see it happen. Ridgeview Estates isn't a perfect neighborhood now. Still has its disagreements, its occasional tense meeting, its differing opinions on gravel color and mailbox height. But it has something it didn't have before, a shared, hard-won understanding that some rules exist to protect people, and those rules deserve real respect. I think that's the real ending here, quieter than any hearing or headline. Not that Karen lost, though she did, thoroughly and publicly, but that an entire community learned, together, the difference between rules that keep people safe and rules that only ever protected one person's need for control. My barrier still stands, taller every year, exactly where I planted it the second time. This time with the whole county watching. This time with the whole neighborhood behind me instead of against me. Some fights really are worth every fine, every sleepless night, every certified letter, because some things, once you build them carefully enough, simply refuse to be torn down for good.